Hello and welcome to another episode of Lockdown Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk about Rob Dillingham and Anthony Edwards lineups. There's a lot of hope there based on an admittedly small sample size, but let's talk about just how dynamic those lineups have been and also how much the limited minutes of Dillingham with no Ant have struggled. We'll also talk about just how crazy this last couple of months for the Wolves has been schedule-wise. They've actually persevered decently through it. I'm gonna make that case. Plus, Wolves-Mavs tonight. It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at Gametime. Today's episode is sponsored by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day and happy Timberwolves game day. The Wolves are on ESPN tonight to take on the Dallas Mavericks in the third and final game of the season series, the rematch of last year's, or I guess this last spring's Western Conference Finals. We'll talk about that toward the end of the show. Of course, the Mavs have a ton of injuries. No Luka got hurt in that Christmas Day game against the Wolves nearly a month ago now. So lots to break down there in that matchup. We'll get to it a little bit later. I do want to start with some lineup stuff and specifically related to Rob Dillingham and Anthony Edwards. We'll talk about that. And then I want to dig in a bit on the last 2 months for Minnesota and how crazy the stretch of games has been. And I understand that, like, I'm not trying to make excuses here for the Wolves, but I'm going to try and make a case that I think is a little bit compelling why there could be a bit of a breakthrough on the horizon for Minnesota as the season wears on. And I'm not saying like top 3 seed in the West, but like, could we at least be talking about comfortably getting out of the play-in here in the next few weeks? We'll talk about all that on the show here today. First of all, though, off the top, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder about our new daily newsletter. You can sign up at lockedondaily.com. You'll get it to your inbox every day, Monday through Friday. It's one stop for Ultimate Wolves coverage and some league coverage. So it'll be right to your inbox again every day, Monday through Friday. All right. Let's talk about Anthony Edwards and Rob Dillingham. Now, fans have been clamoring for Rob to get playing time since preseason, right? Like, everybody wants to see the rookie play. Everyone wants to see the number 8 overall pick play. I get it. We thought at the start of the year there was a pretty good chance he'd be in the rotation. That was my prediction. I think I had him as like their 9th man. I thought there's a chance he'd kind of get the opportunity to be the true backup point guard, allow Nickeil Alexander-Walker to play off the ball more often. I thought maybe he would play when Ant didn't to give them some shot creation when Ant was off the floor, at least from the backcourt, so that Nickeil didn't have to rely, the Wolves didn't have to rely on Nickeil putting the ball on the floor a ton, which he did last time out, and it did not go well. I think it was last game, maybe 2 games ago, where he just struggled with his shot mightily, and we know that Nickeil can get overextended. And obviously Nas does a lot scoring-wise, and Julius Randle would be relied upon, but especially this was before we even knew that Mike Conley would have the struggles he's having this year, given his age and how he's performed to this point. I just thought Rob Dillingham and his backcourt, the potential for his offense for the backcourt would be a nice little punch off the bench, potentially with Nas, more minutes without Ant than with Ant. Well, that never happened. Rob Dillingham was never given a rotation spot. Preseason was a bit of an up and down. So was Summer League, a lot of really good moments, but also some moments where it was very clear why he wasn't in the rotation. He struggled defensively, and you can't struggle defensively and be small. And he is. He's always going to be the smallest player on the floor, unless I'm pretty sure he might be bigger than Jose Alvarado, but maybe he's the only guy in the NBA right now that he's bigger than. He's always going to be the smallest guy on the floor. So you have to do something well defensively to make up for that. And I gave the example, I think on yesterday's show, like Jordan McLaughlin, right? Like Jordan McLaughlin's pretty small, but the dude tried hard defensively. He was a tough, hard-nosed defender and could hold his own on that end of the floor. And that allowed, like, his size was a big reason he hasn't played more over the course of his career. And obviously he's not the athlete or the shot maker that Rob Dillingham is. And that's why there's the ceiling for Rob Dillingham is obviously much, 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 much higher. I only compare them from a size standpoint. And McLaughlin did something defensively. Like he was able to bring something to the table. If Rob Dillingham can play that way, play hard, fight through screens, stick to his guy, like be good off the ball, be opportunistic with steal opportunities, push the pace in the open floor when he does steal the ball, he could find himself some minutes. And we just didn't see that early and in preseason and even in summer league. And then, he just never really got an opportunity. There were a couple of games in there where he played a little bit when Conley was out. And then, of course, Dillingham ends up spraining his ankle, having to go to the G League for a couple of games to rehab. And now he's back and Dante DiVincenzo's out. And so he's getting the opportunity. And I don't have any problem with how Chris Finch has handled this, because Rob Dillingham looks like he's ready now, 43, just over half, 43 games, just over half of the way through the regular season schedule. It doesn't mean he would have been ready on October 15th. It doesn't guarantee that he was ready 3 months ago. We just don't know. He's now had 3 months of NBA practices and shoot-arounds and being on the bench during games. He's played a couple times in the G League. He's gotten a little bit of time here and there, some garbage time. Like, he's not the same guy he was 3 months ago. Like, that's just how this works. We don't know how that would have gone. Hindsight's 2020 when it comes to the Wolves record. But having Rob Dillingham out there wasn't going to help the defense that was struggling at the beginning of the year. It maybe would help the offense, but that wasn't the only problem. The Wolves were struggling on both ends of the floor to start the season. And, it was fair to assume that Mike Conley at some point was going to snap back into form. And he has from outside the arc, which I think should be pointed out. He just hasn't. He's like one of the worst 2-point shooters in the league, and the floater is basically non-existent. And, he's looked a little slower defensively. Like, all those things are true. And now we come to right now, where Rob Dillingham is getting an opportunity to play. And so far, in minutes with Anthony Edwards, which is only 137 possessions. I want to be really clear about that. And I did this last week. Friday, I did, who's going to eat the Dante DiVincenzo minutes, how will the Wolves split that up? And that was before we knew how much Dillingham would play on Friday night, Saturday night, and then again on Monday. And he's played progressively more and probably better than I think anybody expected, even defensively. Like, there were some really rough defensive moments against the Knicks on Friday and the loss on Saturday as well to Cleveland. That there were some bad defensive moments, but he's gotten better each game. I thought the Knicks game was actually the worst defensively. It was a little bit better Saturday, marginally so. Monday, I thought he was okay defensively. I thought it was okay overall. But the point is, offensively, in 137 possessions with Anthony Edwards, Rob Dillingham lineups are a 100th percentile unit. Sorry, not just offensively, overall. Let me be clear about that. Rewind. Overall, not just offensively, they're a 100th percentile unit in 137 possessions. Any lineup with Rob Dillingham and Anthony Edwards together, a plus 23.4 in those 137 possessions. Offensively, they are also a 100th percentile unit, 132.1 points per 100 possessions. Defensively, they're actually competitive. They're 86th percentile, beyond competitive. Good. 108.8 points per 100 possessions. With Anthony Edwards off the floor, Rob Dillingham's played 152 possessions. So he's played 15 more possessions without Ant than with him. Non-Ant Dillingham lineups are a minus 38.5. They're a 0 percentile on both ends of the floor, under 93 points per 100 possessions offensively and over 131 points per 100 possessions defensively. I made this case on Friday because I was looking at it from a with and without DiVincenzo standpoint. And his two most used lineups, Dillingham's without Ant, also happen to both be with DiVincenzo. And the easy reason is, without watching all 300 plus possessions that Dillingham's played to this point this season, is that Dillingham being on the floor with another backcourt creator that also has size and can help him defensively. Now, DiVincenzo, pound for pound, is probably a more effective and certainly more consistent defender than Anthony Edwards. But top line, Anthony Edwards is obviously unlike any other player the Wolves have. And the benefit of having Anthony Edwards on the floor defensively is he can help cover for Rob Dillingham. Offensively, even though DiVincenzo is great with the ball in his hands, and we know he scored almost 16 a game last year for the Knicks, and he was scoring 17, 18 a game, in his brief stint as a starter before he got hurt last week with the Wolves. Anthony Edwards is drawing two defenders almost every time he's got, even when he doesn't have the ball. We saw the way that he was defended both, well, actually the Cavs game and the Memphis game. Guys just sticking to him off the ball. But at the very least, even if he doesn't have the ball, teams are dedicating 1.5 defenders to Anthony Edwards pretty much at all times. And that allows space for a guy like Rob Dillingham to operate. And DiVincenzo's good, and he can beat a lot of guys one-on-one, but their teams aren't doubling Dante DiVincenzo. They are doubling Anthony Edwards. And Rob Dillingham is the perfect player to make teams pay for that, because their opposing teams are going to dedicate all those defensive resources, the actual manpower and attention, but also the quality of defender to Anthony Edwards. And the other guys on the floor, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Rudy Gobert, Jaden McDaniels, like none of those dudes are really making a defense pay. We've seen Jaden do it a little bit more recently because the Wolves have no doubt been telling him, hey, man, you got to put the ball on the floor and do something if you're not going to make threes, because teams are not guarding you. And we've seen him be a little bit more aggressive and actually to pretty decent results of late. But is that sustainable? I doubt it. We haven't seen it at any point in his career at this point for any sustained / extended period of time for Jaden McDaniels. But now Rob Dillingham has the skill set to do it. He's got the tools to be a knockdown three-point shooter. He can escape dribble and knock down threes. He's not just a stationary catch and shoot guy. He can shoot off the dribble. He shot really well off the dribble at every level at Kentucky. He can get to the bucket. He can draw a foul. He can beat you. He's willing to beat you off the dribble and then also create for others if the defense rotates. He's dangerous enough to be effective when Anthony Edwards is on the floor and to make defenses pay for committing resources to stop Anthony Edwards. He's the only other player on the team, save for maybe Naz Reid, who's also been effective in these lineups, that teams actually have to prepare to stop. And I don't think teams are worried about preparing to stop Naz. And I'm also not saying they're preparing to stop Dillingham yet, but the potential is there. And that's kind of the point. Teams really only care about beating Ant, about not letting Ant beat them. The old adage of don't let the best player beat you, make somebody else beat you. Well, the Wolves haven't had anybody else. Julius Randle's not been consistent enough. And teams will have, he's in the game plan. Nobody's game planning to stop Rob and Naz. They're just not. Not in the same way they're game planning to stop Ant and potentially Julius Randle. Rob Dillingham has the ability, and he's got this runway now. He's got these minutes to make teams pay for loading up on Ant. And will that change eventually? And will teams do it? Yeah, but teams having a plan to stop multiple guys who can score, who can put pressure on the defense with the ball in their hands. That's a good thing. It's a good problem to have. Now it's up to Rob to make the jumpers, to create for himself and others, and force teams to start game planning for him. So the space that Rob is helping create for Ant is really, at the moment, creating more space for himself. It's mutually beneficial, obviously, to have both those guys on the floor together. And the non-Rob minutes have not been great. I think a lot of those were I know a lot of those were pre-DiVincenzo injuries. So as Rob gets better, of course, that discrepancy probably continues to expand. But the point I'm making is Rob and Ant together could be a really synergistic offensive unit. And to this point, they've been good defensively too. So that's something to keep an eye on. I want to talk a little bit about the Timberwolves schedule next. And then we'll get into Wolves-Mavs here to close the show. It's all coming up here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Gametime. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. One of my favorite memories is attending a Broadway show this year with my wife. And you could get Broadway show tickets on Gametime. You could get live sporting event tickets, of course, on Gametime. You can get, like I said, the concert tickets, in addition to theater, stand-up comedy, etc. It's all there. Gametime's made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Gametime Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. You can look for tickets to any upcoming game or concert or stand-up show using Gametime. With Gametime Picks, you can find amazing deals and even see the view from your seat before you buy. The super deal is always particularly impressive, offering great seats at unbeatable prices. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the Timberwolves schedule here of late and why it's so impressive that the Timberwolves, impressive isn't the right word. They're still only one game over 500, but I don't want to lose sight of just how challenging the stretch has been and how competitive the Wolves have been consistently. And I know that this is what some people aren't going to want to hear this. And there's plenty of other teams that the Wolves have been healthy too. I should point that out. That is an advantage the Wolves have had, generally speaking. I know now DiVincenzo's hurt. There's been some things here and there. There was Dillingham. There's now Terrence Shannon. But like rotation guys have been, knock on wood, healthy. But listen to this. This is crazy. So between November 21st, which was 2 months ago, yesterday was January 21st. So 2 months ago, between November 21st and the New Orleans game on January 7th. Okay. So take that span of 6 weeks. The Timberwolves only played 3 games against below 500 teams. And all 3 of those games were against teams that were only 1 game below 500 when they played the Wolves. November 21st was that loss to the Raptors that started a 4-game losing streak. The Wolves ended up at 8-10, which was their low water mark, 2 games below 500 back on November 27th. But going back to the 21st, the only 3 teams that they played that were below 500 when they played the Wolves were Sacramento, Atlanta, and Detroit. All 3 of those teams are now above 500, and all 3 of those teams are in playoff position, or at least play-in position. The Kings are actually ahead of the Wolves in the standings. The Pistons are above 500, and who's the other one I said? The Hawks are also above 500 and actually 6th in the Eastern Conference right now. So all three of those 500, those teams that were a game below 500 when they played Minnesota, are now above 500 and in at least the play-in. Going all the way back to November 21st. So November 21st to January 7th. During that stretch, the Wolves really only played 2 horrendous games. We'll call them stinkers, only twice. And those were against those competitive teams, those more competitive teams. Detroit, or I'm sorry, I should say less competitive teams compared to the rest of the teams during that stretch. The Detroit game on January 4th, they lost by 14. That was a miserable game, a bottom 3 game the Wolves have played all season. There's no question about that. And then there was the Hawks game, which was right after or right before Christmas. Right before Christmas, they lost by 13 at the Hawks. And there was another Knicks game there that was brutal. So they played 3 stinkers over the course of 6 weeks that were just non-competitive double-digit losses. One was to a very good Knicks team. 2 were two of the worst teams they played during that entire stretch. The Wolves went from November 20, or actually, let me say it this way. The Wolves didn't play a bottom 3 team in the NBA until January 7th when they played New Orleans. And since then, they played New Orleans and Washington. But there's been 3 terrible teams all league. Washington, all season. Washington's won 6 games. Utah has played a little better recently. They're up to 10 wins, and New Orleans has 12. And actually, now Charlotte and Toronto have less wins than New Orleans. The Wolves have played both Charlotte and Toronto. They split against Toronto, and they beat Charlotte. But they still haven't played the Jazz, who are a 10-win team in their conference, which is very weird. They played the Wizards once, and now they've only played the Pelicans once. But they hadn't played any of the league's worst 3 teams for the first 2.5 months of the season, which is also crazy. The way that turned out for Minnesota is absolutely nuts. And then I mentioned this on yesterday's show, on Monday's show, in terms of the actual travel schedule. The last time Minnesota has played consecutive home games was exactly a month ago, December 19th and 21st. Right before Christmas, they played the Knicks and Golden State. They lost to both of them. Since then, Minnesota has either been on the road or alternating home and road games, has not played 2 consecutive home games in over a month. And they will finally this week after Dallas's game tonight, after against Dallas. So they'll go from the 21st of December to the 25th of January before they get to play consecutive home games. And actually, technically the 27th of January, because that's the second of the 2 home games. Minnesota won't play more than 2 home games together still until February 1st, when they get a 5-game homestand that basically leads, I guess it's about a week before the All-Star break. So think about that. Not consecutive home games, which means, and there were no extended breaks in there. That means the Wolves weren't, there's no off days. They're all either a travel day or a game day. And I know there's teams that also go through this, but I'm just pointing it out for the Wolves that they went this whole stretch with that. And they basically, they're 1 game above 500 now. They were at 500, or actually 1 game above 500 the last time that this happened, that they got to play consecutive home games. So they played to basically 500. But again, I go back to the point I made a minute ago. They've only really had, 3 really terrible games since then. And there's been disappointing losses and close late losses. And it's well documented the Wolves have played the most crunch games of any team in the NBA, and they've struggled with them. They're below 500 in crunch situations. And the Memphis game, actually both Memphis games are great examples of that, where the Wolves just fell apart late, execution was poor, etc. And it's what's hampered them, what's kept them from getting more than 3 games above 500 all season long. I mean, that's their high water mark is 3 games above 500. Their low water mark is 2 games below 500. And it's not going to get easier either. Like it gives me some hope because eventually the schedule will by definition get easier because they're going to have to play Utah 3 times still the rest of the season. They're going to get another game against Washington. They're going to get another couple games against New Orleans. They play Portland again once. I know they lost to them twice earlier, but they'll play them again. So eventually that's going to even out. But in the near term, it's Dallas, Denver, Atlanta, Phoenix. So that's 4 more straight above 500 playoff teams. And then you get, Phoenix, I guess, is at 500. And then you get Utah and Washington consecutively. Sacramento, who's playing better. Then you get Chicago, who is, below 500, but actually in the play-in right now in the Eastern Conference. So it will ease up right around when the calendar flips to February. So the Wolves really need to, win 2 out of 3 against Dallas, Denver, and Atlanta before the Phoenix, Utah, Washington, Sacramento, Chicago stretch. And then not long after that, you get Portland, and then you get a bunch of OKC. There's 3 OKC games in a week. I guess one's right before the All-Star break, and then 2 are right after. So all that to say, the scheduling's been crazy for Minnesota, and they've had some bad breaks. They've been fortunate on the injury front, but the way that they played some of these teams, they're now a top 15 offense, which I realize is just whatever, but it's been worse. And they are still a top 7 defense. So things are still trending in the right direction. They'll eventually get DiVincenzo back. Hopefully now this Dillingham thing can help, shore up the offense and give him some confidence. There's still a lot to be hopeful for here moving forward for Minnesota. And I do think the way that they've handled the last few weeks, it could be a lot worse. It definitely could be a lot worse. All right, I want to close by looking at the Wolves-Mavs matchup for tonight. We'll do that. We'll set up that and then the upcoming schedule. All that is upcoming here next. All right, let's go ahead and close the show by talking about the Wolves-Mavs matchup tonight. The Timberwolves, of course, played Dallas, as I mentioned earlier, on Christmas Day. That was a win in Dallas. Luka Doncic hurt his calf in that game. He's been out ever since. Initially, I think the timeline is supposed to be about a month. So he's, should be coming back at any point, but it won't be this game against the Wolves. The Mavs also have some other injuries. Dwight Powell's missed some time. Jaden Hardy was out last game. There's a couple of players who are considered questionable on the injury report for Dallas. And last time out, we'll talk about the Wolves-Mavs game up from Christmas a little bit in a minute here. But the Mavericks lost to the Charlotte Hornets last time out by 5. Charlotte is 11-28. And they're now the third worst record in the NBA. The Wolves beat Charlotte way back in early November. But Dallas lost to Charlotte 110-105. Kyrie had 33 in the game. Daniel Gafford had 31 and 15. And nobody else really came to the party at all for the Dallas Mavericks. And Kyrie's when Luka got hurt back on Christmas Day at that time, the Mavericks were, let's see, I had it pulled up here. When the Wolves and Mavs played on Christmas Day, the Wolves won that game. Following that game, Dallas had a 19-11 record. They were 8 games above 500. They're now just 23-20. So without Luka Doncic, they've only won 4 games. They're 4-9 since Luka went down with the injury. And obviously Kyrie's great. He's had an amazing run in Dallas already, but without Luka Doncic, Klay Thompson's not Klay Thompson anymore. PJ Washington can't sustain offense for long periods of time. Daniel Gafford's always been a bit of a thorn in the Timberwolves side, but size-wise, they just aren't that big of a team either. So now Dallas is only 3 games above 500 after that loss to Charlotte. And overall, they've lost 4 of their last 5 games, including a loss at New Orleans and a pair of losses to Denver. So they've lost to 2 of the 3 worst teams in the NBA in Charlotte and New Orleans in the past week. And the only game that they won, weirdly enough, was against the OKC Thunder a few days ago. So, which I believe was a game SGA didn't play in, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, SGA sat that game, and Dallas actually ended up winning it. So certainly a winnable game for Minnesota. As of right now, this is there's actually no line on FanDuel, so there's no line for this game. It wouldn't surprise me if the Timberwolves probably should be favored, even though this game's in Dallas with no Luka and the way the Mavs have played lately. I wouldn't be shocked if the Timberwolves were favored by a couple of points in this one. In terms of what to expect, well, actually, let's rewind just a little bit and talk about what we saw the last time the Wolves and Mavs played on Christmas Day, that game in which Luka got hurt. In that one, Anthony Edwards had 26, 8, and 5. The Timberwolves were they had a huge second quarter. The Timberwolves were up by 17 at halftime, and they were up by 22 going to the fourth quarter. Dallas made a bit of a furious comeback, and this was actually only a 6-point win for Minnesota, but it should have been a much bigger win for the Timberwolves. Overall, let's see. Julius Randle had 23, 10, and 8 in this game. Rudy had 14 and 10. Again, Luka got hurt in the second quarter, like right before halftime. So he finished with just 14 points in 60 minutes, and Kyrie had 39 points in this one. Nobody else in the Mavericks scored more than 12 besides Luka and Kyrie, and that was Klay Thompson. Quentin Grimes had 10 off the bench for Dallas. Dallas will, even without Luka, they're going to push pace. Like, obviously, that's what Kyrie wants to do. Defensively, they're still a pretty good defensive team. Good protection in the paint. Dallas has. They're not a great defensive rebounding team, so there are second chance opportunities for Minnesota. I know the Wolves don't get a lot of those, but recently, like first half against Memphis, they got a bunch of second chance opportunities. I think that they've done a pretty good job going back to like last year in the playoffs, not necessarily against Dallas, but against Phoenix and Denver. Minnesota was opportunistic with who crashed the glass and when. I think that's something that they can do with their wings, Jaden, maybe Ant, like just be a little more aggressive on the offensive glass. It's a bit sketchy against a team that can run, and you know, the Wolves don't necessarily need that high variance in a game that they again should be favored to win with no Luka Doncic. But I mean, even without him, Dallas is still going to get to the free throw. Like Kyrie still attempts attempts about 4 free throws per game. PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, those guys each attempt about 3 free throws per game. Spencer Dinwiddie is still a crafty enough guard at this age that you still have to look out for him. Quentin Grimes, like I mentioned earlier, he gave the Wolves trouble last time out. He's questionable for this game, but he's averaging 10 points a game and shooting almost 40% from 3. The keys for me in this one is Minnesota to limit Dallas in transition, snag a couple of additional offensive rebounds for the Wolves for some second chance opportunities, and then make open shots. I mean, we saw that being a big problem last time out early in the game against Memphis. The Wolves did withstand the cold shooting, and ultimately with some other issues down the stretch, which was taking too many threes, not getting into the paint late, offensive flow, etc. But I think the open shots that the Wolves offense has been generating, they just have to knock those down. And I know that sounds so simple, but that's been one of their biggest problems this year, is just making those open shots. I talked about a week ago about corner threes. And I mean, I think the Friday game against the Knicks that they ended up winning, it was the third quarter. They missed a ton of corner threes in the third, like wide open corner threes. That can't happen against a team like Dallas. You have to take advantage of those moments, especially on the road. And again, I know that this is a shorthanded Dallas team they should beat, but also if you want to add in like the Western Conference standings and the playoff implications, the Wolves are 1 game behind Dallas. If they win this game, they also win the tiebreaker. So not only would they tie them for 7th in the Western Conference, but they also get the tiebreaker, so that actually move ahead of them and would carry that tiebreaker through the rest of the season, because again, this is the third and final game between the Wolves and Mavs. So it's actually a really big game for Minnesota. And I talked earlier in the show about what's upcoming on the Timberwolves schedule. It doesn't get easier. I mean, like, it's been a difficult stretch, but in the near term, at least, things do not get easier. They follow up the game in Dallas on Wednesday. Thankfully, they finally get 2 days off on Thursday and Friday before they go home for Denver, who's played much better lately. That's a Saturday matinee. So they get 2 full days off and then an afternoon game, off Sunday, and then home for Atlanta. But Dallas and Denver, and then Atlanta, and then back out on the road to the West Coast. Like, it's important to win this game. And given no Luka, given the tiebreaker implications, given the fact the Wolves have lost now 2 in a row and 3 out of 4 and 4 out of 6, or however you want to look at it, this is an important game for Minnesota. All right. Of course, there will be the Locked On Wolves postcast following the game. It'll be Jack and Luke over at the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, and then that audio will be right here on Locked On Wolves. I'll be back on Thursday with the post-game podcast, so be sure to check that out that'll post overnight into early Thursday. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also subscribe to the daily Locked On Wolves newsletter over at lockedondaily.com. One-stop shop for ultimate Wolves and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Again, sign up at lockedondaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.